Tycoon returns to find ex-wife with twins who look just like him, and his mistress as he slid into the plush leather seat. Carlos felt a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation coursing through his veins. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of business deals and global travel, each day pushing him further from the life he once knew. But now, finally back in his hometown, a different kind of excitement stirred within him. "To Ms. Julia's apartment, sir?" the driver asked, catching Carlos's eye in the rearview mirror. Carlos nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, and make it quick. I've been away far too long." As the limousine glided through the city streets, Carlos's mind wandered to Julia. His pulse quickened at the thought of her flowing dark hair, her infectious laugh, the way she understood him like no one else. She had been his rock during the tumultuous end of his marriage, his confidant as he rebuilt his empire, and now something more. The city lights blurred past the window, but Carlos barely noticed. He was lost in thoughts of tender moments stolen between business calls, of passionate nights in luxurious hotel rooms across the globe. Julia was everything his ex-wife Marina wasn't: ambitious, exciting, undemanding. As the car approached Julia's high-rise apartment building, Carlos felt a familiar tension in his chest. It was a feeling he'd grown accustomed to over the years, the thrill of a secret rendezvous mixed with a twinge of guilt he couldn't quite shake. The limousine came to a stop, and Carlos took a deep breath, straightening his tie. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, his heart racing with anticipation. "Welcome home, Mr. Mendez." The doorman greeted him with a knowing smile. Carlos nodded in response, striding purposefully towards the elevator. As he watched the floor numbers climb, he couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. He had it all: success, wealth, power, and a beautiful woman waiting for him. What more could a man want? The elevator doors opened, and Carlos walked down the hallway, his footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. He paused for a moment outside Julia's door, composing himself. Then, with a smile that could charm the world, he knocked. The door swung open, revealing Julia's radiant face. "Carlos!" she exclaimed, her eyes lighting up with joy and desire. As he pulled her into a passionate embrace, Carlos felt the last 6 months of stress and loneliness melt away. Here, in Julia's arms, he was home. Little did he know that this moment of blissful reunion was just the calm before a storm that would turn his carefully constructed world upside down. The grand Mendez estate stood silent, its manicured lawns and ornate fountains a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within. Inside, the air was thick with tension as raised voices echoed through the marble halls. "You're never here, Carlos. Do you even remember what it's like to have a family?" Marina's voice cracked with emotion, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Carlos paced the room, his jaw clenched tight. "I'm building an empire, Marina. For us. Can't you see that? An empire?" Marina scoffed, her voice dripping with bitterness. "What good is an empire if you're alone in it?" The words hung heavy in the air, each syllable a dagger to Carlos's heart. He turned to face his wife, really seeing her for the first time in months. The woman before him was a far cry from the vibrant, laughing bride he'd married years ago. Her eyes, once full of love and admiration, now held only disappointment and resignation. Carlos began, but the words died on his lips. What could he say? That he was sorry? That he'd change? Even as the thoughts formed, he knew they'd be lies. Marina shook her head, a sad smile playing on her lips. "You don't even know how to be here anymore, do you?" The truth of her words stung, but Carlos's pride wouldn't let him admit it. Instead, he lashed out, his voice cold and cutting. "And you've become nothing more than a trophy wife, content to spend my money and complain about my absence." The moment the words left his mouth, he regretted them. He watched as something broke in Marina's eyes, a final thread of hope snapping. "Get out," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and anger. "Marina, I didn't mean, get out," she screamed, grabbing a nearby vase and hurling it at the wall. It shattered, the sound echoing through the room like a death knell for their marriage. Carlos stumbled backward, shocked by the outburst. Without another word, he turned and left, the heavy oak door slamming behind him with a finality that shook them both. As he stormed out of the house and into the cool night air, Carlos felt a strange mix of relief and despair. He loosened his tie, gasping for breath as the reality of what had just happened washed over him. His marriage, once the foundation of his life, had crumbled to dust. In that moment, standing alone in the shadow of the home he'd built but never truly lived in, Carlos made a decision. He'd throw himself into his work, build that empire Marina had mocked. He'd show everyone, that he didn't need a family to be successful. Little did Carlos know, as he drove away from the estate that night, that his actions would set in motion a chain of events that would come back to haunt him in ways he could never imagine. The empire he was so determined to build would soon face its greatest challenge, not from business rivals, but from the very family he was leaving behind. Marina wandered through the halls, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous rooms. Each space held memories, now tainted with the bitterness of her failed marriage. She paused before a large mirror, studying her reflection. The woman staring back at her seemed a stranger, eyes dulled by loneliness, shoulders hunched under the weight of abandonment. "Is this who I've become?" she whispered to her reflection, her voice barely audible in the stillness of the house. As if in response, a wave of nausea suddenly washed over her. Marina clutched the ornate frame of the mirror, steadying herself as the room spun. This wasn't the first time she'd felt ill in recent weeks, but she'd attributed it to stress and heartache. Now, a flicker of suspicion ignited in her mind. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone, dialing her doctor's number. The wait for an appointment felt interminable, each day bringing new worries and possibilities. Finally, sitting in the sterile exam room, Marina heard the words that would change everything. "Congratulations, Mrs. Mendez. You're pregnant." The doctor's voice seemed to come from far away, muffled by the rushing in Marina's ears. Pregnant. The word echoed in her mind, a mix of terror and wonder. "But how far along?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. The doctor consulted her chart. "Based on your last period and the ultrasound, I'd say about 10 weeks. Marina's breath caught in her throat. 10 weeks. It had been nearly 3 months since Carlos left. This child, this miracle, had been conceived during their last, tumultuous days together. As she left the clinic, Marina's mind raced. Should she tell Carlos? Did he have a right to know? The thought of reaching out to him, of making herself vulnerable again, made her stomach churn. Standing on the sidewalk, one hand unconsciously resting on her still flat stomach, Marina made a decision. This child was hers, her chance at a new beginning, a family of her own making. Carlos had made his choice when he walked out that door. She would make hers now. "We'll be okay, little one," she murmured, a small smile playing on her lips for the first time in months. "You and me against the world." As Marina hailed a taxi, a mix of determination and fear coursed through her veins. She had no idea of the challenges that lay ahead, or how this decision would ripple through time, affecting not just her life, but the lives of Carlos and the child growing within her. The taxi pulled away from the curb, carrying Marina towards an uncertain future. Little did she know that fate had an even bigger surprise in store, one that would test her strength, reshape her world, and eventually bring her face to face with the man who had broken her heart. Julia's eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the financial reports before her. A small smile played on her lips as she absorbed the numbers. Profits were up, and Carlos's empire was growing faster than anyone had anticipated. She leaned back in her chair, a sense of pride and anticipation washing over her. "Ms. Julia?" Her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Mr. Mendez is on line 1. Julia's heart skipped a beat. She took a deep breath, composing herself before picking up the phone. "Carlos, darling," she purred, her voice a mixture of honey and steel. "I was just reviewing the quarterly reports. You'll be pleased." Carlos's deep chuckle resonated through the line. "I'm sure I will be, especially with you at the helm while I'm away. How are things really going, Julia?" There it was, that hint of intimacy that blurred the lines between professional and personal. Julia reveled in it, in the power it gave her. "Everything's under control," she replied, her tone confident. "The board is eating out of my hand, and the new Asian markets are exceeding expectations. But," she paused for effect, "it's not the same without you here." She could almost hear Carlos's smile through the phone. "I miss you too," he said, his voice lowering. "I'll be back soon, and we'll celebrate our successes privately." As they discussed business, Julia's mind wandered to their relationship. She had started as Carlos's assistant years ago, watching from the sidelines as his marriage to Marina crumbled. She had been there, a shoulder to lean on, an ear to listen, and eventually much more. Now, as she sat in what was essentially his chair, running his company in his absence, Julia felt a thrill of excitement. This was what she had always wanted: power, success, and Carlos. But a nagging doubt lingered in the back of her mind. Would it last? Could she truly hold on to a man like Carlos Mendez? "Julia? Are you still there?" Carlos's voice snapped her back to the present. "Yes, sorry," she replied quickly. "Just thinking about all we've accomplished. We make quite a team, don't we?" Carlos said, his tone warm. "I couldn't do this without you, Julia. You know that, right?" Julia's heart swelled at his words. "I know," she said softly. "And I'll always be here for you, Carlos. Always." As they said their goodbyes, Julia placed the phone back in its cradle, her mind racing. She turned to look out the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing at the city sprawled below. This view, this office, this life, it was all within her grasp. But she knew better than anyone how quickly fortunes could change. Julia's eyes hardened with determination. She had fought tooth and nail to get here, and she wasn't about to let anyone or anything threaten her position. Not the board, not the competitors, and certainly not the ghosts of Carlos's past. Little did Julia know that the greatest threat to her carefully constructed world was already in motion, set in place by a decision made months ago in a doctor's office across town. As she turned back to her desk, ready to conquer the business world, fate was preparing a challenge that would test her resolve and potentially unravel everything she had worked so hard to achieve. "Sure, it's okay, my loves. Mommy's here," Marina cooed, gently rocking two small bundles in her arms. Her eyes, though tired, shone with an unmistakable love as she gazed down at her newborn twins. The past months had been a whirlwind of emotions and challenges. The discovery of twins during her second trimester had initially sent Marina into a panic. How could she, alone and still reeling from her divorce, possibly manage two babies? Now, as she held Luca and Leah close, Marina couldn't imagine life any other way. They were her world, her reason for pushing through the sleepless nights and endless doubts. A soft knock at the door broke through her reverie. "Marina? It's me, Elena. I brought some food," came her sister's voice. "Come in," Marina called out softly, careful not to disturb the now-sleeping infants. Elena entered, her arms laden with containers. She paused, taking in the sight of her sister with the twins. "Oh, Marina," she sighed, setting down the food and moving closer. "They're beautiful. How are you holding up?" Marina managed a tired smile. "I'm surviving. They're worth every moment of exhaustion." Elena sat beside her sister, gently stroking Leah's cheek. Have you thought any more about telling Carlos?" she asked hesitantly. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Marina's face hardened slightly, her grip on the twins tightening imperceptibly. "No," she said firmly. "He made his choice, Elena. He walked away from our family. These two, they're mine, ours. We don't need him." Elena nodded, though concern flickered in her eyes. "I understand. But Marina, they're his children too. Don't you think he has a right to know?" Marina turned away, her gaze falling on a framed ultrasound picture on the nightstand. In that grainy image, she had first seen her babies, two tiny miracles that had given her life new purpose. "He lost that right," Marina whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "when he chose his empire over us, when he..." She trailed off, old pain resurfacing. Elena wrapped an arm around her sister's shoulders. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you. You're doing an amazing job, Marina. These little ones are lucky to have you. As if on cue, Luca stirred, his tiny fist waving in the air. Marina smiled down at him, her resolve strengthening. We'll be okay, she said, more to herself than to Elena. The three of us will make our own family, our own happiness. But even as she spoke the words, a small part of Marina couldn't help but wonder. Would there come a day when Luca and Leah would ask about their father? Would they resent her for keeping this secret? And what would happen if, by some twist of fate, Carlos ever discovered the truth? As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the apartment windows, Marina pushed these thoughts aside. For now, she had two precious lives depending on her. Whatever the future held, she would face it with the fierce love of a mother protecting her cubs. Little did Marina know that fate was already setting the stage for a reunion that would shake the foundations of the lives she and Carlos had built apart. As she rocked her babies to sleep, miles away, Carlos was making plans that would inadvertently bring their worlds crashing back together. Yes, that's right. I want to finalize the deal tonight, Carlos spoke authoritatively into the phone. We've come too far to let this slip through our fingers now. His voice echoed in the vast, empty space of the suite. As he ended the call, a triumphant smile played across his lips. Another successful negotiation, another step towards the empire he had dreamed of building. Carlos walked to the window, surveying the city below. From this height, the people looked like ants, scurrying about their insignificant lives. He felt powerful, untouchable. Yet, as he stood there, king of all he surveyed, an inexplicable emptiness gnawed at him. He shook off the feeling, reaching for the bottle of expensive scotch on the nearby bar. As he poured himself a generous measure, his phone buzzed with a message from Julia. Congratulations on closing the deal. Wish I was there to celebrate with you. Miss you. Carlos smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He typed out a quick response, promising to make it up to her when he returned. As he hit send, his gaze fell on a framed photo on the desk, a relic from another life. It was him and Marina on their wedding day, both beaming with hope and love. For a moment, Carlos allowed himself to remember. The warmth of Marina's smile, the sound of her laughter, the feeling of coming home to someone who truly knew him. But those memories were quickly overshadowed by the arguments, the loneliness, the feeling of suffocation that had driven him away. He picked up the frame, studying it. I've outgrown that life, he muttered to himself, as if trying to convince the man in the photo. This is who I am now. This is what I was meant for. With a decisive motion, he opened a drawer and placed the photo face down inside, shutting it away along with the memories it evoked. Carlos turned back to the window, raising his glass in a silent toast to his own reflection. To the future, he said aloud, his voice echoing in the empty room. To empire building. As he savored the burn of the scotch, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He had everything he thought he wanted: success, wealth, freedom. So why did victory taste so hollow? Pushing the unsettling thoughts aside, he reached for his phone again, dialing his assistant. Book me on the next flight home, he instructed. It's time to take things to the next level. Little did Carlos know that his decision to return would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, love, and the true meaning of family. As he gazed out at the city lights, blissfully unaware, fate was already weaving the threads that would soon entangle his carefully constructed world with the lives he had left behind. The stage was set for a reunion that would shake the very foundations of Carlos's empire, forcing him to confront the ghosts of his past and the unexpected consequences of his choices. And somewhere across the ocean, in a small apartment, two tiny hearts beat in sync, unknowingly waiting for the moment their world would change forever. As he exchanged pleasantries with a group of investors, Carlos's eyes scanned the room, a habit born from years of always seeking the next opportunity. Suddenly, his gaze froze, locked on a familiar figure across the crowded space. His breath caught in his throat, the champagne flute nearly slipping from his grasp. There, looking more radiant than he remembered, stood Marina. But she wasn't alone. Clutching her hands were two small children, a boy and a girl, their eyes wide with wonder at the glittering scene around them. Time seemed to stand still as Carlos stared, his mind racing. The children looked to be about 4 or 5 years old. Their faces, even from this distance, stirred something deep within him. A strange sense of recognition, of connection, washed over him. Excusing himself from the group, Carlos found himself moving towards Marina and the children as if drawn by an invisible force. As he approached, Marina's eyes met his, widening with a mix of shock and something else. Fear? "Marina," Carlos said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't expect to see you here." Marina's grip on the children's hands tightened almost imperceptibly. "Carlos," she replied, her tone carefully neutral. "It's been a long time." The little boy tugged at Marina's dress. "Mama, who's that?" he asked, his curious eyes fixed on Carlos. Carlos felt his heart skip a beat at the child's words. "Mama." His gaze darted between Marina and the children, noting their features, the familiar set of their jaws, the curve of their noses. "These are my children," Marina said, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of tension. "Luca and Leah." The names hit Carlos like a physical blow. Twins, a boy and a girl. Their age, their appearance, the timing. His mind raced, piecing together a puzzle he never knew existed. "Your children," he repeated, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. They're beautiful, Marina." Leah, the little girl, stepped forward slightly, her eyes, so like his own, studying Carlos intently. "You look like the man in Mama's old pictures," she said innocently. Carlos felt the world tilt on its axis. Old pictures. Of course, Marina would have kept photos from their life together. He looked at Marina, 1,000 questions burning in his eyes. Marina met his gaze, her expression a complex mix of defiance and uncertainty. "We should go," she said quietly, gently pulling the children back. "It was unexpected to see you, Carlos." As she turned to leave, Carlos found his voice again. "Marina, wait," he called out, his tone urgent. "We need to talk. Please." Marina paused, looking back at him over her shoulder. For a moment, Carlos saw a flicker of the woman he once knew, vulnerable and conflicted, but it was quickly replaced by a steely resolve. "Not now, Carlos," she said firmly. "This isn't the time or place." With that, she guided the children through the crowd, leaving Carlos rooted to the spot, his mind reeling from the implications of what he'd just witnessed. As the gala continued around him, Carlos stood frozen, oblivious to the curious glances and whispered conversations. His carefully constructed world had just been shaken to its core, and nothing would ever be the same again. In that moment, surrounded by the glitz and glamour he had worked so hard to achieve, Carlos Mendez felt more lost than he ever had before. The empire he had built suddenly seemed hollow in the face of the family he never knew he had, and the realization of everything he had missed. "It can't be," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling. "Those children, they can't be mine." But even as he spoke the words, Carlos knew in his heart they were a lie. The resemblance was undeniable. Luca's determined little chin, Leah's inquisitive eyes. He had seen those same features staring back at him in the mirror countless times. A maelstrom of emotions swept through him. Shock, anger, confusion, and something else. Something he hadn't felt in years. Longing. The image of those two small faces looking up at him with innocent curiosity burned in his mind. "Mr. Mendez?" A concerned voice broke through his turmoil. It was Julia, looking stunning in her evening gown, a hint of worry in her eyes. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Carlos turned to her, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "Julia, I think I just met my children." Julia's eyes widened in shock. "What? Carlos, what are you talking about?" He recounted the encounter in halting words, watching as Julia's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to something harder to read. "Twins," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A boy and a girl. They must be about 5 years old. And they look— God, Julia, they look just like me." Julia's hand came to rest on his arm, her touch both comforting and somehow unsettling. "Carlos, are you sure? This is huge. If it's true, then Marina has been keeping my children from me for years," Carlos finished, a surge of anger cutting through his confusion. How could she do that? How could she not tell me? Julia's grip on his arm tightened slightly. "Maybe she had her reasons," she said carefully. "You did leave her, after all." The words hit Carlos like a physical blow. He had left. He had walked away from his marriage, from Marina, never looking back. And in doing so, he had unknowingly walked away from his own children. "I need to know for sure," he said, his voice gaining strength as determination set in. "I need to talk to Marina, to understand why she kept this from me." Julia nodded slowly, her expression guarded. "Of course. But Carlos, you need to be careful. This could change everything." As Carlos looked back into the glittering ballroom, his eyes searching for Marina and the twins, he felt a seismic shift in his world. The empire he had built, the life he had crafted for himself. Suddenly, it all seemed inconsequential in the face of this new reality. "Everything has already changed, Julia," he said softly, his gaze fixed on the spot where he had last seen his newfound family. "And I need to make it right." With those words, Carlos Mendez set foot on a path that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, about love, and about the true meaning of success. As he re-entered the gala, purpose in his stride, he was unaware of the conflicting emotions playing across Julia's face, or the ripple effect his discovery would have on all their lives. The stage was set for a confrontation that would unearth long-buried secrets, force painful reckonings, and perhaps, just perhaps, offer a chance at redemption and reunion that none of them had ever dared to hope for. "Marina," he called out, his voice cutting through the ambient chatter. "Please wait." She froze, her back stiffening at the sound of his voice. Slowly, she turned to face him, her expression a complex tapestry of emotions: fear, anger, and something that looked almost like regret. "Carlos," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I told you, this isn't the time or place." He closed the distance between them, acutely aware of the curious glances from the other guests. The twins looked up at him with wide, questioning eyes, and Carlos felt a surge of emotion so strong it nearly knocked him off his feet. "I think we're well past worrying about the right time or place," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Marina, are they mine?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with years of unspoken truths and buried pain. Marina's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she looked from Carlos to the children and back again. "Mama!" Luca's small voice broke the tension. "Who is this man?" Marina took a deep breath, her hand protectively on Luca's shoulder. "This is an old friend of Mama's," she said, her eyes never leaving Carlos's face. "We need to go home now, sweethearts." "Marina, please," Carlos pleaded, his voice cracking with emotion. "I deserve to know. They deserve to know." For a moment, Marina's carefully constructed facade crumbled, and Carlos saw the pain and turmoil she'd been carrying all these years. "You deserve?" she hissed, her voice low and intense. "You lost the right to deserve anything when you walked out on us, Carlos. On me." The words hit him like a physical blow, and he staggered slightly. "I didn't know," he whispered. "How could I have known? Would it have made a difference?" Marina shot back, her voice trembling. "Would you have stayed if you'd known I was pregnant?" Carlos opened his mouth to respond, but found he had no answer. The truth was, he didn't know. The man he had been then, so focused on building his empire, so sure that he didn't need a family, would he have made a different choice? "Mama, I'm tired," Leah's small voice interrupted, tugging at Marina's dress. "Can we go home?" Marina's expression softened as she looked down at her daughter. "Yes, darling, we're leaving now," She turned back to Carlos, her eyes hard once more. "This conversation is over, Carlos. Please, just leave us alone." As she turned to go, Carlos felt a desperation he'd never known before. "I can't do that, Marina," he said, his voice low and intense. "Not now that I know. We need to talk about this. About them." Marina paused, looking back at him over her shoulder. For a brief moment, Carlos saw a flicker of the woman he'd once loved, vulnerable and conflicted. But it was quickly replaced by a steely resolve. "You made your choice years ago, Carlos," she said, her voice barely audible. "Now you have to live with it." With that, she guided the twins through the exit, leaving Carlos standing alone in the middle of the crowded ballroom. His world irrevocably changed. As he watched them disappear into the night, Carlos felt a determination unlike anything he'd ever experienced before. He had built an empire from nothing, faced down ruthless competitors, and come out on top. But now, he faced the greatest challenge of his life, finding a way back into the lives of the family he never knew he had. The gala continued around him, but Carlos was oblivious to it all. His mind raced with plans, with questions, with a burning need to make things right. Little did he know that his quest for redemption would set in motion a chain of events that would test him in ways he could never have imagined, forcing him to confront not just his past, but the very foundations of the life he had built. It was on a crisp autumn morning that Carlos finally gathered the courage to confront Marina directly. He stood outside her modest apartment building, his heart pounding in his chest as he pressed the buzzer. "Who is it?" Marina's voice crackled through the intercom, tinged with suspicion. Carlos took a deep breath. "It's me, Marina. We need to talk." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Carlos thought she might ignore him. Then, with a soft buzz, the door unlocked. As he made his way up the stairs, Carlos rehearsed the speech he'd prepared. But all his carefully chosen words evaporated when Marina opened the door. She looked tired, her eyes wary, but there was a fierce protectiveness in her stance that took his breath away. "What do you want, Carlos?" she asked, her voice low and guarded. He swallowed hard, suddenly feeling like the young, uncertain man he'd been when they first met. "The truth, Marina. I want to know about our children." Marina's eyes flashed with a mix of anger and pain. "Our children? They stopped being our children the day you walked out that door." "I didn't know," Carlos exclaimed, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "How could you keep this from me for 5 years?" "Keep it from you?" Marina's voice rose, her composure cracking. "You left me, Carlos. You chose your precious empire over our family. I found out I was pregnant weeks after you were gone, with no way to reach you." Carlos felt as if the ground was shifting beneath his feet. But surely you could have found a way to contact me." "My company. Your company." Marina interrupted, bitter laughter edging her words. "The same company that sent divorce papers to my doorstep 3 months after you left? The one that made it clear that Carlos Mendez was not to be disturbed with personal matters." The weight of her words hit Carlos like a physical blow. He remembered those early days of building his empire, how he'd instructed his lawyers to handle the divorce swiftly and quietly. Had he really been so cold, so disconnected? "Marina, he began, but she cut him off. "No, Carlos, you don't get to waltz back into our lives now and play the victim. Luca and Leah have grown up without a father because that's what you chose. You can't undo 5 years of absence with a sudden attack of conscience." As she spoke, Carlos caught a glimpse of movement behind her. There, peeking around the corner, were Luca and Leah, their eyes wide with curiosity and confusion. "Mama!" Leah's small voice called out. "Who's at the door?" Marina's expression softened as she turned to the children, but Carlos saw the flash of panic in her eyes. She was trying to protect them, he realized, protect them from him. In that moment, looking at the family he'd unknowingly abandoned, Carlos felt a surge of determination unlike anything he'd ever experienced. He'd built an empire from nothing, faced down ruthless competitors, and come out on top. But now, he faced the greatest challenge of his life, finding a way to make amends and become the father his children deserved. "Marina," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I have no right to ask this, but please, give me a chance to make this right. Not for me, but for them." Marina looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a deep sigh, she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. As Carlos crossed the threshold into their home, he felt as if he was stepping into a new world, one filled with possibilities, challenges, and the chance for redemption he never knew he needed. Little did he know that this moment would set in motion a series of events that would test his resolve, challenge his priorities, and force him to confront the true meaning of family and success. Marina ushered the twins into their bedroom, speaking to them in hushed tones before returning to face Carlos. Her eyes were guarded, her posture defensive. "You have 10 minutes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then I need you to leave." Carlos nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I understand. But Marina, I need to know for certain. Are they really mine?" Marina's eyes flashed with anger and hurt. "How dare you question that? Look at them, Carlos. They have your eyes, your smile. Luca has your stubborn chin, and Leah, she has your insatiable curiosity." As she spoke, Carlos felt a mixture of joy and crushing guilt wash over him. He sank onto the nearby couch, his head in his hands. "I've missed so much," he murmured, his voice breaking. "Yes, you have," Marina replied, her tone softening slightly. "But that was your choice." Carlos looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I need to make this right, Marina. I want to be part of their lives. Please, tell me how I can prove that I'm sincere." Marina studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh, she reached for her phone. "If you're serious about this, Carlos, then you'll agree to a paternity test. Not because I have any doubts, but because I need to protect my children. If you're going to be in their lives, it needs to be official, legal." Carlos felt a stab of pain at her words, but he nodded. "Of course, whatever it takes." As Marina made the call to arrange the test, Carlos's mind raced. He thought of his empire, of Julia waiting for him back at the office, of the life he'd built that suddenly seemed so empty. He realized with startling clarity that he was willing to risk it all for a chance to know his children. "It's set," Marina said, pulling him from his thoughts. "The lab can see us tomorrow morning." Carlos nodded, standing up. "Thank you, Marina. I know I don't deserve this chance, but I promise you, I won't waste it." As he moved towards the door, a small voice stopped him in his tracks. "Are you leaving already?" Leah asked, peeking out from her bedroom. Carlos turned, his heart clenching at the sight of his daughter. Yes, I have to go now, but I'll be back soon, if that's okay with your mom." Leah nodded solemnly, her eyes so like his own, studying him intently. "Will you tell us a story next time?" "Leah," Marina warned gently, but Carlos held up a hand. "I'd love to tell you a story," he said softly, kneeling down to Leah's level. "How about I bring a special book with me next time?" Leah's face lit up with a smile that was achingly familiar. "Promise." "I promise," Carlos said, his voice thick with emotion. As he left the apartment, Carlos felt a mix of hope and trepidation. The paternity test loomed ahead, a formality that would officially confirm what his heart already knew. But beyond that lay the real challenge, proving to Marina, to the twins, and to himself that he could be the father they deserved. Walking down the street, Carlos pulled out his phone, his finger hovering over Julia's number. He knew he owed her an explanation, but how could he possibly explain the seismic shift that had just occurred in his life? With a deep breath, he pocketed the phone and hailed a taxi. As the city lights blurred past the window, Carlos felt like he was standing on the edge of a precipice. The life he had known was behind him, and ahead lay an uncertain future filled with both promise and peril. Little did he know that his decision to embrace fatherhood would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge not just his relationships, but the very empire he had spent years building. The real test was just beginning, and Carlos Mendez was about to discover that the price of redemption might be higher than he ever imagined. Julia looked up from her desk as he entered, her smile fading as she took in his haggard appearance. "Carlos? What's wrong? You look like you haven't slept in days." He sank into the chair across from her, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Julia, we need to talk. Something's happened. Something that's going to change everything." Julia's eyes narrowed, a flicker of concern crossing her face. "What is it, Carlos? Is it the merger? Did something go wrong with the Asian markets?" Carlos shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "No, nothing like that. It's personal." He took a deep breath, meeting her gaze. "I have children, Julia. Twins. With Marina." The silence that followed was deafening. Julia's face went through a kaleidoscope of emotions. Shock, disbelief, hurt, and finally, a carefully controlled neutrality. "Children?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. How is that possible?" Carlos recounted the events of the charity gala and his subsequent meeting with Marina, watching as Julia's composure cracked with each word. 5 years, she said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "You've had children for 5 years and you never knew?" "I didn't," Carlos insisted, leaning forward. "Julia, you have to believe me. I had no idea until I saw them at the gala." Julia stood abruptly, turning to face the window. Her shoulders were tense, her reflection in the glass a mask of conflicting emotions. "And now?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "What does this mean for us, Carlos? For everything we've built together?" Carlos felt a pang of guilt. In the whirlwind of discovering his children, he hadn't given much thought to how it would affect his relationship with Julia. I don't know," he admitted. "But I can't ignore this, Julia. They're my children. I've already missed so much of their lives." Julia turned back to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And what about our life, Carlos? Our plans? Are you just going to throw it all away for a family you never knew you had?" The accusation in her voice stung, but Carlos couldn't deny the truth in her words. He stood, moving towards her, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Don't," she said, her voice breaking. I need time to process this." Carlos nodded, feeling a chasm opening between them. "I understand. But Julia, I hope you know that you're important to me too. I don't want to lose what we have." Julia's laugh was hollow, devoid of humor. "What we have? Carlos, you've just told me you have a secret family. Everything has changed." As he watched her struggle to maintain her composure, Carlos realized the full impact of his discovery. It wasn't just his life that had been upended, Julia's world was crumbling too. "I'm sorry," he said softly, knowing the words were inadequate. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Julia nodded, turning back to the window. "I know, but intentions don't change reality, Carlos. You need to figure out what you want, and I need to decide if I can be part of this new life of yours." As Carlos left the office, the weight of Julia's words settled on his shoulders. He had been so focused on connecting with his newfound children that he hadn't considered the collateral damage to his current relationships. Stepping into the elevator, Carlos felt like he was caught between two worlds: the empire he had built with Julia by his side, and the family he never knew he had. As the doors closed, he couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what choice he made, someone would end up hurt. Little did he know that Julia, watching his retreating form from the window, was already formulating a plan that would test Carlos's newfound commitment to his children and potentially destroy everything he held dear. The game had changed, and Julia was determined not to be left behind in the dust of Carlos's past. Marina opened the door, her expression a mixture of wariness and resignation. "You're early," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. Carlos nodded, swallowing hard. "I couldn't sleep. I brought the book I promised Leah." As if summoned by her name, Leah appeared in the hallway, her eyes lighting up at the sight of Carlos. "You came back!" she exclaimed, her excitement palpable. Carlos felt his heart swell with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Of course I did. I promised, didn't I?" Luca peeked out from behind his sister, his gaze more cautious but equally curious. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to the package in Carlos's hands. Carlos knelt down, bringing himself to their eye level. "It's a special book. I thought maybe we could read it together." Marina watched the interaction with a mix of emotions playing across her face. "Children, why don't you show Carlos to the living room while I finish getting ready?" As the twins led Carlos to their small but cozy living room, he couldn't help but notice the drawings pinned to the walls, the scattered toys, the unmistakable signs of a loving home. It was a stark contrast to his own sterile penthouse, and he felt a pang of regret for all he had missed. Settling onto the worn couch with Luca and Leah on either side of him, Carlos carefully unwrapped the book. "This was my favorite story when I was your age," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. "Really?" Luca asked, his earlier caution giving way to curiosity. "What's it about?" As Carlos began to read, his rich voice bringing the story to life, he felt a warmth spreading through his chest. The twins leaned in, their eyes wide with wonder, and for a moment, it was as if the years of absence melted away. But the moment was shattered by Marina's return. "It's time to go," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We don't want to be late for the appointment." Reality crashed back in, and Carlos felt the weight of the impending paternity test settle on his shoulders. As they prepared to leave, Leah tugged on his sleeve. "Will you come back and finish the story?" she asked, her eyes pleading. Carlos glanced at Marina, seeking permission. She gave a small nod, her expression unreadable. "Of course," he promised Leah, "as soon as I can." As they made their way to the clinic, the twins chattering excitedly in the back seat, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The test results would make his paternity official, but the real challenge lay ahead, proving to Marina, to the twins, and to himself that he could be the father they deserved. Little did Carlos know that across town, Julia was setting her own plans in motion. Her fingers flew across her keyboard as she dug deep into Marina's past, searching for anything that could protect her position in Carlos's life. The game was far from over, and Julia was determined to hold on to everything she had worked so hard to achieve. As the car pulled up to the clinic, Carlos took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. The path to redemption was never easy, but he was beginning to realize that the reward, the love of his children, was worth any price he might have to pay. Taking a deep breath, he picked up his phone and dialed Marina's number. "It's me," he said softly when she answered. "The results are here. Can we meet?" There was a pause on the other end, heavy with unspoken tension. "All right," Marina finally replied. "The park near our apartment, in an hour?" Carlos agreed, his heart racing as he ended the call. He grabbed his jacket and headed out, barely acknowledging his staff as he left. The drive to the park felt both interminable and far too short. As he approached the playground, he saw them. Marina sat on a bench, watching Luca and Leah as they played on the swings. The sight of them, carefree and laughing, made his chest tighten with a mixture of joy and regret. "Marina," he called out softly as he neared. She turned, her expression guarded. "Carlos, do you have them?" He nodded, sitting down beside her and pulling out the envelope. With shaking hands, he opened it and pulled out the papers inside. It's confirmed. I'm their father." Marina let out a breath, closing her eyes briefly. "I never doubted it," she said quietly. Carlos looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the years of struggle etched in the lines around her eyes. "Marina, I want to be part of their lives. I want to make up for lost time." She turned to face him, her eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and pain. "Make up for lost time? Carlos, you can't just waltz back into our lives and expect everything to be okay. Do you have any idea how hard it's been? Raising them alone, working 2 jobs just to make ends meet." Her words hit him like a physical blow. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the inadequacy of the words burning in his throat. "I know it doesn't change anything, but I truly am sorry, and I want to help now in any way I can." Marina's laugh was bitter. "Help? And how do you propose to do that, Carlos? You can't buy back the years you've missed." "I know that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can be here now. I can support you, support them. Please, Marina, give me a chance to prove myself. As they talked, neither noticed Luca and Leah approaching until they were standing right in front of them. Mama, Leah asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Is he our daddy? The question hung in the air, charged with potential. Marina looked at Carlos, a silent challenge in her eyes. This was it, the moment of truth. Carlos knelt down, bringing himself to the twins' eye level. Yes, he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. I am your father, and I know I haven't been here for you, but if you'll let me, I'd like to be part of your lives now. Luca, always the more cautious one, frowned slightly. Why weren't you here before? The question, so innocent yet so pointed, made Carlos's heart clench. I made a mistake, he admitted, looking from Luca to Leah and then up to Marina. A big mistake. But I'm here now, and I promise you both, I'm not going anywhere. As the twins processed this information, their reactions a mix of confusion and tentative hope, Carlos felt the weight of his promise settle on his shoulders. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be challenges and setbacks ahead. But looking at these two small faces, so like his own, he knew with absolute certainty that he would do whatever it took to be the father they deserved. Little did Carlos know that his determination to make things right with his newfound family was about to collide head-on with the life he'd built. Across town, Julia sat in her office, a folder of carefully gathered information on Marina open before her. Her eyes glinted with a mixture of hurt and determination as she picked up her phone. It's time, she said to the person on the other end. We need to protect what's ours. As the sun began to set over the park, casting long shadows across the playground, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of love, loyalty, and redemption. Carlos, caught between his past and his future, was about to face the fight of his life, not in the boardroom, but in the hearts of those he held dear. Julia's phone buzzed, startling her from her reverie. Carlos's name flashed on the screen, causing a conflicting surge of emotions within her. With a deep breath, she answered. Julia. Carlos's voice came through, sounding tired but oddly content. I'm sorry I've been so distant lately. Can we talk? Julia's grip tightened on the phone. Of course, Carlos. I think we have a lot to discuss. They agreed to meet at their favorite restaurant, a quiet, upscale place where they had celebrated countless business victories. As Julia arrived, she saw Carlos already seated at their usual table, looking more disheveled than she'd ever seen him. Julia, he said, standing to greet her. His smile was warm, but there was a hesitancy in his eyes that hadn't been there before. As they sat down, an uncomfortable silence settled between them. Julia watched Carlos fidget with his napkin, a telltale sign of his nervousness. So, she finally said, her voice carefully neutral. How are things with your family? Carlos looked up, surprise and guilt flashing across his face. It's complicated, he admitted, but good. I'm getting to know the twins and Marina. Well, she's understandably cautious. Julia nodded, taking a sip of water to hide the trembling of her hand. And where does that leave us, Carlos? Where does it leave the company? Carlos leaned forward, his eyes earnest. Julia, you have to know how important you are to me, to the business. Nothing has to change, Nothing has to change. Julia interrupted, her carefully constructed facade cracking. Everything has already changed, Carlos. You have children, family. Where do I fit into that picture? The pain in her voice was palpable, and Carlos reached across the table to take her hand. Julia, please. I know this is difficult, but difficult doesn't begin to cover it, Julia said, pulling her hand away. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what came next. Carlos, there's something you need to know about Marina. Carlos's brow furrowed in confusion. What are you talking about? Julia reached into her purse, pulling out a slim file. I've done some digging, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. There are things in Marina's past, things that might make you reconsider this whole situation. As she slid the file across the table, Julia watched a myriad of emotions play across Carlos's face. Confusion, anger, and then a deep, profound sadness. "You investigated her?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Julia felt a flicker of doubt, but pushed it aside. "I had to protect us, Carlos. The company, our future. You don't know what she might be after." Carlos stared at the file for a long moment, then slowly pushed it back across the table. "No," he said firmly. "I don't want to know. Whatever's in there, it doesn't change the fact that Luca and Leah are my children." "But Carlos No, Julia," he interrupted, his voice gaining strength. "I've already missed 5 years of their lives. I won't miss any more because of suspicion and mistrust." As he stood to leave, Julia felt panic rising in her chest. "Carlos, please, don't throw away everything we've built together." He paused, looking down at her with a mix of sadness and resolve. "I'm not throwing anything away, Julia, but I have to make this right. I hope you can understand that." As Carlos walked out of the restaurant, Julia sat frozen, the untouched file mocking her from the table. She had gambled and lost, and now she felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Outside, Carlos leaned against his car, his mind reeling. He pulled out his phone, staring at Marina's number on the screen. He knew he should tell her about Julia's investigation, but the thought of jeopardizing the fragile trust they were building made him hesitate. As he stood there, caught between his past and his future, Carlos realized that the real battle was just beginning. He had chosen his path, but the consequences of that choice were yet to unfold. With a deep breath, he made a decision and dialed Marina's number, knowing that his next words could either build a bridge to his new family or burn the last remnants of the life he once knew. The night air hummed with tension as Carlos waited for Marina to answer, unaware that his world was about to be shaken once again by forces beyond his control. "Carlos, is everything all right?" He took a deep breath, steadying himself against his car. "Marina, I need to see you. There's something we need to discuss. It's important." There was a pause on the other end, filled with unspoken questions. "The twins are already in bed," Marina said hesitantly. "It's not about the twins," Carlos replied, his voice soft but urgent. "It's about us, about our past." Another pause, longer this time. Carlos could almost feel Marina's apprehension through the phone. Finally, she sighed. "All right, come over in half an hour." "But Carlos, this better be important." As he drove through the city streets, Carlos's mind raced. How could he explain Julia's actions without destroying the fragile trust he and Marina had begun to rebuild? And what of Julia herself? The hurt in her eyes haunted him, a stark reminder of the collateral damage his newfound family had caused. Arriving at Marina's apartment, Carlos hesitated before knocking. The weight of his decisions, past and present, pressed down on him like a physical force. When Marina opened the door, her face a mask of cautious curiosity, he felt his resolve waver. "Come in," she said, leading him to the small living room. The remnants of the twins' evening, scattered toys and a half-finished puzzle, surrounded them, a poignant reminder of what was at stake. They sat in silence for a moment, the air thick with tension. Finally, Marina spoke. "What's this about, Carlos? What was so urgent it couldn't wait until morning?" Carlos leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly together. "Marina, I need to be honest with you about everything." He told her about Julia, about their relationship, and about the investigation. As he spoke, he watched Marina's expression shift from surprise to anger to a deep, profound sadness. "So," she said when he finished, her voice barely above a whisper, "you've been building a life with someone else all this time, and now she's digging into my past." Carlos reached out, wanting to comfort her, but Marina pulled away. "I didn't know about the investigation until tonight," he said urgently, "and I refused to look at whatever she found. Marina, please believe me, I want to make this work. For us, for the twins." Marina stood, pacing the small room. "And what about her, Carlos? This Julia? What does she want?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Carlos ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of his choices pressing down on him. She wants things to stay the same, but I've told her that's not possible. Not anymore. Marina turned to face him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. And what do you want, Carlos? Really want? The question struck him like a physical blow. What did he want? The empire he'd built, the life he'd crafted with Julia? Or this new, terrifying, exhilarating chance at family? I want to be a father to Luca and Leah, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I want to make up for lost time. And Marina, I want to see if there's still something between us. If we can rebuild what we once had. The words hung in the air, charged with potential. Marina's expression softened, a mix of hope and fear playing across her face. But before she could respond, a sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. They exchanged a confused glance. It was late, far too late for casual visitors. Marina moved to answer, but Carlos gently held her back. Let me, he said, a sense of foreboding settling in his stomach. As he opened the door, Carlos felt the world tilt on its axis. There, standing in the hallway with a look of grim determination, was Julia. And beside her, looking equally resolute, was his lawyer. Carlos, Julia said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions in her eyes. We need to talk. All of us. As Marina appeared behind him, Carlos felt the carefully constructed bridges between his past and future begin to crumble. The night, it seemed, was far from over, and the true test of his commitment was about to begin. What is this about, Julia? Carlos asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. I told you I didn't want any part of your investigation. Julia's eyes flashed with a mixture of hurt and determination. This isn't just about you anymore, Carlos. It's about the company, our future, everything we've built. Marina stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. I don't know who you think you are, but you have no right to come into my home and— Mrs. Mendez, Richard interrupted, his tone coolly professional. I assure you we have every right. There are matters of grave importance that need to be addressed. Carlos felt a chill run down his spine at the lawyer's words. What matters? He demanded. Speak plainly, Richard. What's this all about? Julia took a deep breath, her gaze shifting between Carlos and Marina. We've uncovered some discrepancies in the timeline of your separation and the twins' birth. Marina's sharp intake of breath was audible in the suddenly silent room. Carlos felt his heart racing, a sense of dread settling in his stomach. What are you implying? He asked, his voice dangerously low. Richard cleared his throat, pulling out a folder from his briefcase. Mr. Mendez, according to our investigation, there's a possibility that you may not be the biological father of the twins. The words hit Carlos like a physical blow. He staggered slightly, steadying himself against the wall. Marina's face had gone pale, her eyes wide with shock and— Was that fear? That's impossible, Carlos said, his voice barely above a whisper. The paternity test can be manipulated, Julia finished, her tone softer now, almost sympathetic. Carlos, we have reason to believe that Marina may have deceived you. Marina's voice, when it came, was filled with a fury that made everyone in the room flinch. How dare you? You come into my home, accuse me of lying, of manipulating. Do you have any idea what I've been through? Carlos turned to her, his eyes searching her face. Marina, he said softly, is there any truth to this? Any at all? The moment stretched between them, charged with years of unspoken truths and buried pain. Marina's eyes filled with tears, her voice breaking as she spoke. Carlos, it's complicated, but Luca and Leah, they're yours. In every way that matters, they're yours. The room fell silent, the weight of Marina's words hanging heavy in the air. Carlos felt as if the ground was shifting beneath his feet, everything he thought he knew crumbling away. Julia stood, her face a mask of triumph tinged with sadness. Carlos, you need to think about what this means. For you, for the company. We can't let this jeopardize everything we've worked for. But Carlos barely heard her. His eyes were fixed on Marina, on the woman he had once loved, the mother of the children he had come to adore. In her eyes, he saw fear, regret, and a desperate plea for understanding. "I think," he said slowly, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart, "that you should all leave, now." Julia started to protest, but Richard placed a hand on her arm, shaking his head slightly. As they gathered their things and moved towards the door, Carlos felt a strange calm settling over him. Once they were gone, he turned back to Marina. The silence between them was deafening, filled with unasked questions and unspoken truths. "Marina," he said softly, "I think it's time you told me everything, from the beginning." As Marina sank into a chair, her face in her hands, Carlos steeled himself for a conversation that would change everything. Outside, the first light of dawn was breaking, a new day dawning on a world that would never be the same. In that moment, caught between his past and his future, Carlos realized that the true test of love, of family, was just beginning. And as Marina looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope, he knew that whatever came next would define not just their lives, but the lives of Luca and Liar as well. The stage was set for revelations that would shake the very foundations of their world, and Carlos found himself facing the most important decision of his life. As he sat down across from Marina, ready to hear the truth, he couldn't help but wonder, could love truly conquer all, or were some betrayals too deep to ever fully heal? Marina took a deep, shaky breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Carlos," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I never meant for any of this to happen. You have to believe that." Carlos leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Just tell me the truth, Marina. All of it." She nodded, closing her eyes briefly as if gathering strength. "After you left," she began, "I was lost, broken. I didn't know how to move forward without you." As Marina's story unfolded, Carlos felt his world tilting on its axis. She spoke of loneliness, of a brief, desperate encounter with an old friend who offered comfort in her darkest hour, of discovering her pregnancy weeks later and the paralyzing fear that gripped her. "I didn't know, Carlos," Marina said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know if the babies were yours or his, but I knew I wanted them to be yours. I needed them to be yours." Carlos stood abruptly, pacing the small room, his mind reeling. "So you lied?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. "You manipulated the paternity test?" Marina's tears flowed freely now. "I had a friend at the lab. She helped me. I was desperate, Carlos. I couldn't bear the thought of losing the last connection I had to you." The silence that followed was deafening. Carlos stared out the window, his reflection a mask of conflicting emotions. "And now?" he asked softly. "Do you know? Are Luca and Liar?" "I don't know," Marina admitted, her voice small and broken. "I've never been sure. But Carlos, does it matter? You've bonded with them. They adore you. You're their father in every way that counts." Carlos turned to face her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Of course it matters, Marina. How could it not? I've opened my heart to them, changed my entire life. And now you're telling me they might not even be mine." A soft sound from the hallway made them both freeze. There, standing in the doorway in their pajamas, were Luca and Liar. Their small faces were etched with confusion and fear. "Daddy!" Leah's voice was trembling. "Why are you yelling at Mama?" The sight of the twins hit Carlos like a physical blow. He looked at their faces he'd come to love, faces he'd searched for traces of himself in, and felt his heart breaking. Marina moved quickly to the children, kneeling down to their level. "It's okay, my loves," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mama and Daddy are just having a grown-up talk." But Luca, always the more perceptive one, looked straight at Carlos. "Are you leaving us?" he asked, his lower lip quivering. The question hung in the air, charged with all the pain and uncertainty of the moment. Carlos felt as if he was standing on the edge of a precipice, His next words, his next action, carrying the weight of all their futures. He moved slowly, kneeling down in front of the twins, looking into their eyes that might or might not carry his DNA. He felt a surge of love so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. "No," he said firmly, gathering them both into his arms. "I'm not leaving. I'm right here." As he held Luca and Leah close, Carlos met Marina's gaze over their heads. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of gratitude, love, and lingering fear. They both knew that this moment was just the beginning, that there were still mountains to climb and battles to fight. But for now, in the warm morning light of Marina's small living room, Carlos made a silent vow. Whatever the truth might be, whatever challenges lay ahead, he would be there. For Luca, for Leah, and yes, even for Marina. As the twins clung to him, their small bodies warm and trusting, Carlos realized that sometimes, love truly was thicker than blood. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with legal battles, emotional turmoil, and hard decisions. But in that moment, holding his children, for they were his children, regardless of biology, Carlos knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The sun climbed higher in the sky, a new day dawning on a family forever changed but somehow, against all odds, growing stronger. The true test of their love and commitment was just beginning. But for the first time in a long while, hope blossomed in the hearts of both Carlos and Marina. "Mr. Mendez," his lawyer, a stern-faced woman named Sarah, began, "I must advise you to proceed with caution. The situation with Marina and the children is complicated, to say the least." Carlos leaned forward, his eyes tired but determined. "I understand the legal ramifications, Sarah, but these are my children. Biology be damned. I won't abandon them now." Sarah sighed, shuffling the papers before her. "And what of the company, Carlos? Julia has made it clear that she intends to fight for control if you pursue this family situation." The mention of Julia sent a pang of guilt through Carlos's heart. He hadn't spoken to her since that fateful night at Marina's apartment. "Let her try," he said, his voice low and determined. "I built that company from the ground up. It's mine." As they discussed legal strategies and potential outcomes, Carlos's mind wandered to the quiet moments he'd shared with Luca and Leah over the past weeks. The bedtime stories, the park visits, the simple joy of being called Daddy. He couldn't imagine his life without them now. Leaving Sarah's office, Carlos's phone buzzed with a message from Marina. "The twins are asking for you. Can you come over?" Without hesitation, he replied, "On my way." As he drove through the city streets, Carlos's mind raced with the challenges ahead. The potential custody battle, the fight for his company, the lingering questions about the twins' paternity. But as he pulled up to Marina's apartment building, all of those worries faded into the background. The moment he knocked on the door, it flew open, and two small bodies collided with his legs. "Daddy!" Luca and Leah cried in unison, their faces beaming with joy. Carlos scooped them up, his heart swelling with love. "Hello, my little ones," he said, planting kisses on their cheeks. "I've missed you." Marina appeared in the doorway, her smile tinged with a hint of sadness. "They've been asking for you all day," she said softly. As Carlos entered the apartment, still holding the twins, he felt a sense of rightness wash over him. This was where he belonged, regardless of DNA tests or legal battles. Later that evening, after the twins had been tucked into bed, Carlos and Marina sat on the small balcony, the city lights twinkling below them. "I met with my lawyer today," Carlos said, breaking the comfortable silence. Marina tensed beside him, and he turned to face her, taking her hand in his. "I'm going to fight, Marina, for the twins, for us, for this family we're building." Tears welled up in Marina's eyes. "Carlos, I don't know what to say. After everything I've done, we've both made mistakes," he interrupted gently. "But these children, they're innocent in all this. They deserve a family, a father who loves them unconditionally. And that's what I intend to be." Marina squeezed his hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "What about Julia? The company?" Carlos's jaw set with determination. I'll deal with Julia. And if I have to choose between the company and our family, well, it's not even a choice. As they sat there, hand in hand, looking out over the city they both loved, Carlos felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with legal battles and emotional hurdles. But he knew with unwavering certainty that he was on the right path. Little did they know that across town, Julia was laying plans of her own. In her luxurious penthouse office, she pored over documents and made hushed phone calls, her eyes glinting with a mixture of hurt and determination. "Yes," she said into her phone, her voice low and intense. "I want everything you can find on Marina's past. And the children, I want to know every detail about their birth. Leave no stone unturned." As she hung up, Julia turned to stare out at the city skyline, the empire she and Carlos had built together looming large in her view. "I'm sorry, Carlos," she whispered to the empty room, "but I can't let you throw everything away for a lie." The stage was set for a showdown that would test the limits of love, loyalty, and the true meaning of family. As night fell over the city, for lives hung in the balance, their fates intertwined in ways none of them could have imagined. As the elevator ascended, Carlos's mind raced with memories of the past few weeks. The laughter of Luca and Leah as they played in the park, Marina's grateful smile as he helped with bedtime routines, the quiet moments of connection that had begun to heal old wounds. He steeled himself, knowing that what he was about to do could jeopardize everything he'd built professionally, but also understanding that some things were worth more than any empire. The boardroom doors loomed before him, and with a deep breath, Carlos pushed them open. The room fell silent as he entered, all eyes turning to him. Julia sat at the head of the table, her posture rigid, eyes glinting with a mixture of hurt and determination. "Carlos," she said, her voice cool and professional, "we were just discussing the recent developments in your personal life." He nodded, taking his place at the table. "I'm sure you were, and I'm here to address those developments head-on." The tension in the room was palpable as Carlos began to speak, his voice steady and clear. "I know there have been rumors and speculation about my involvement with Marina and her children. I'm here to confirm that yes, I am committed to being a father to Luca and Leah, regardless of biological certainty." Murmurs rippled through the room, but Carlos pressed on. "I understand that this may cause concern for some of you. You might worry about the impact on the company on our public image. But I stand here today to tell you that my commitment to this company remains as strong as ever." Julia leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Carlos, be reasonable. You can't possibly juggle a new family and the demands of running this corporation." The shareholders, Carlos interrupted, his voice firm, "invested in me, in my vision, my drive, my ability to balance multiple priorities. That hasn't changed." He turned to address the entire board. "I built this company from the ground up. I've navigated us through economic downturns, fierce competition, and technological revolutions. I can assure you, becoming a father will not diminish my capability to lead." The room fell silent, the board members exchanging glances. Carlos could feel the weight of their judgment, their uncertainty, but he stood firm, his resolve unshaken. Suddenly, the boardroom doors burst open, and a familiar figure strode in. It was Elena, Marina's sister, her face flushed with emotion. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "but there's something you all need to know." Carlos felt his heart race as Elena approached, handing him a sealed envelope. "Marina wanted me to give you this," she said softly. She couldn't face coming here herself. With shaking hands, Carlos opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the contents. As he read, the color drained from his face, and he had to grip the table to steady himself. "Carlos," Julia's voice cut through the haze of his shock. "What is it?" He looked up, his eyes meeting Julia's, then sweeping across the room to take in the expectant faces of the board members. In that moment, he realized that whatever was written in that letter had the power to change everything. His relationship with Marina, his bond with the twins, the future of his company. Taking a deep breath, Carlos straightened his shoulders, ready to face whatever came next. "It's the truth," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The whole truth about Luca and Leah. As he prepared to read the letter aloud, Carlos felt as if he were standing on the edge of a precipice. Whatever Marina had revealed in those pages would set the course for all their futures. The room held its collective breath, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. In that suspended moment, Carlos realized that sometimes the greatest tests of character come not in boardrooms or business deals, but in the quiet moments when we choose love over fear, family over fortune. As he began to read, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart, he knew that no matter what the letter contained, his path was clear. He would fight for his family, for love, for the future he now knew he wanted more than any corporate success. The fate of Mendez Enterprises, of Carlos's relationship with Marina, of his bond with Luca and Leah, it all hung in the balance as the words of Marina's letter filled the hushed boardroom, setting the stage for a resolution that would change all their lives forever. "My dearest Carlos, by the time you read this, I will have already left the city with Luca and Leah. I'm sorry for the pain this will cause you, but I believe it's the only way to protect our children and give you the freedom to choose your path without the burden of our complicated past. The truth is, Carlos, that Luca and Leah are indeed your biological children. There was never any doubt, despite what I led you to believe in my moment of weakness and fear. The paternity test was real, unaltered. My lie about its manipulation was born from a desperate attempt to hold on to you, to give you a reason to stay even if you didn't want to. I realize now how selfish and misguided that was. You deserved the truth from the beginning, and I robbed you of 5 years with your children. For that, I can never fully atone. I'm leaving to give you space to decide what you truly want, without the pressure of our presence. If you choose to find us, to be a part of Luca and Leah's lives, we'll be waiting. But if you decide that your life, your company, is where you need to focus, know that I understand and I don't blame you. The children will always know of their brave, successful father. Whatever you choose, you'll always be a hero in their eyes, and in mine. With all my love and deepest regrets, Marina." As Carlos finished reading, the room fell into a stunned silence. He looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, to find every face in the boardroom fixed on him. Julia sat frozen, her expression a mix of shock and something that looked almost like relief. "They're mine," Carlos whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "They were always mine." The realization hit him like a physical blow. All the doubts, the fears, the complicated emotions of the past weeks crashed over him in a wave of overwhelming clarity. He had children, his children, and they were out there somewhere waiting for him to make a choice. Julia was the first to break the silence. "Carlos," she said softly, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge, "what are you going to do?" He turned to her, seeing for the first time the pain and resignation in her eyes. In that moment, Carlos understood that she had known, perhaps before he did, how this would end. "I have to find them," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "My family, I can't lose them again." One of the board members cleared his throat. "Mr. Mendez, while we sympathize with your personal situation, we must consider the company. Your responsibilities here are important," Carlos interrupted, standing up straight, "but not as important as my children, as the family I never knew I wanted until now." He looked around the room, meeting each person's gaze. "I've given everything to this company. My time, my energy, my youth, and I'm proud of what we've built together. But if being a father to Luca and Leah means stepping down as CEO, then that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make." The room erupted in a flurry of voices, some protesting, others offering support. But Carlos barely heard them. His mind was already racing, planning his next move, figuring out how to find Marina and the twins. As he turned to leave, Julia's voice cut through the chaos. "Carlos, wait." He paused, looking back at her. She stood, her posture straight but her eyes softening. "Go," she said simply. "Find your family. I'll handle things here." For a moment, they shared a look of understanding. an acknowledgement of the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Then Carlos nodded, gratitude clear in his eyes, and strode out of the boardroom. As he rushed through the building, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement, Carlos felt as if he were shedding layers of his old self with each step. By the time he reached the street, hailing a taxi with urgent waves, he was no longer Carlos Mendez, ruthless CEO. He was simply a father, desperate to reunite with his children. "Where to, sir?" the taxi driver asked. Carlos paused for a split second, then said with unwavering certainty, "The airport, as fast as you can." As the taxi merged into traffic, Carlos's mind raced with possibilities. Where would Marina have taken the twins? How would he find them? And most importantly, would they forgive him for the lost time? The city blurred past the windows, but Carlos's vision was focused on a future he could barely imagine, a future with bedtime stories, scraped knees, and the indescribable joy of watching his children grow. He didn't know where this journey would lead, but for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. Little did Carlos know that his quest to reunite with his family would take him on an adventure across continents, forcing him to confront not just his past mistakes, but also the very foundations of what it means to be a father, a partner, and a man truly worthy of the love he so desperately sought. It had taken days of frantic searching, calling in favors, and piecing together fragments of information before he'd stumbled upon a lead. Marina's childhood friend, reluctant at first, had finally revealed that she'd mentioned a small coastal town in Portugal, a place where Marina's grandmother had once lived. As the flight attendant passed by, Carlos caught his reflection in her tray. He barely recognized himself, disheveled, unshaven, eyes bright with a desperate hope he hadn't felt in years. He was a far cry from the polished CEO who had once ruled boardrooms with an iron fist. "Sir, would you like anything to drink?" the attendant asked, her voice pulling him from his reverie. Carlos shook his head, managing a weak smile. "No, thank you. Actually, wait. How much longer until we land?" "About 2 hours, sir," she replied kindly, noting his obvious distress. 2 hours. In 2 hours, he would be one step closer to finding his family, to righting the wrongs of the past 5 years. Carlos closed his eyes, memories of Luca and Leah flooding his mind, their laughter, their curious questions, the way they looked at him with unconditional love despite the short time they'd known him. As the plane began its descent into Lisbon, Carlos felt his anxiety peak. What if he was too late? What if Marina had changed her mind and didn't want him in their lives anymore? The moment his feet touched Portuguese soil, Carlos was in motion. He rented a car, his broken Portuguese somehow getting him through the transaction, and set off towards the coastal town of Nazar. The drive was a blur of winding roads and breathtaking ocean views, but Carlos barely noticed. His mind was focused on one thing: finding his family. As he entered the small town, its narrow streets lined with whitewashed houses, he felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if something in his blood recognized this place. Pulling up to a small cafe in the town square, Carlos approached an elderly man sitting outside. "Disculp," he began hesitantly. "I'm looking for a woman and 2 children who might have arrived recently." "The woman's name is Marina." The old man's eyes lit up with recognition. "Ah, a Marina calm as Cryankas. Sim. He pointed towards a path leading down to the beach. "Casa Azul, Puerto do Mar." Carlos's heart leapt. A blue house near the sea. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had moments ago. He thanked the man profusely and set off down the path, his steps quickening with each passing moment. And then, as he rounded a bend, he saw it. A small blue house perched on the edge of a cliff, overlooking the vast Atlantic. And there, playing in the sand below, were 2 small figures he would recognize anywhere. Luca, Leah. The names tore from his throat before he could stop them. The children looked up, their eyes widening in disbelief. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with cries of "Daddy!" they were running towards him, sand flying in their wake. Carlos fell to his knees as the twins collided with him, their small arms wrapping around his neck. He held them close, tears streaming down his face, murmuring words of love and apology. A soft gasp made him look up. There, standing on the porch of the blue house, was Marina. Her hand was over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and brimming with tears. Slowly, still holding the twins, Carlos stood. "Marina," he called out, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here. I found you." As Marina slowly made her way down to the beach, her steps hesitant yet drawn to him like a magnet, Carlos felt the weight of the moment. This was it, the culmination of years of mistakes, missed opportunities, and newfound love. The family stood there on the beach, the sound of crashing waves providing a backdrop to their reunion. As Carlos looked from Marina to the twins and back again, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever explanations were needed, one thing was certain: he was exactly where he was meant to be. The sun began to set over the Atlantic, casting a golden glow over the scene. It was the end of one journey, but Carlos knew it was just the beginning of another. As he held his family close, he silently vowed to never let them go again, to spend the rest of his life making up for lost time and building the future they all deserved. Little did they know that their story was far from over. Back in the city, forces were in motion that would soon test their newfound happiness, forcing Carlos to confront the consequences of his past decisions and fight for the family he had only just reclaimed. As Luca regaled them with a story about his latest sandcastle masterpiece, Carlos caught Marina's eye across the table. Her smile, soft and genuine, made his heart skip a beat. There was still so much unresolved between them, so many conversations yet to be had, but in moments like these, he felt a glimmer of hope for their future. After the twins were tucked into bed, their room filled with the soft sound of their breathing, Carlos and Marina found themselves on the small porch overlooking the ocean. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of salt and possibility. "They're so happy you're here," Marina said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "I've never seen them like this." Carlos turned to her, his eyes shining with emotion. "I'm happy too, Marina. Happier than I've been in, well, maybe ever." She nodded, a shadow crossing her face. "Carlos, we need to talk about what happens next. This can't last forever." He felt his heart constrict at her words. "Why not?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why can't this be our life?" Marina sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Your company, your life back home. Carlos, you've built an empire. I can't ask you to walk away from all that." "You're not asking," he said firmly, taking her hand in his. "I'm choosing."